My name is Paulina Hernández-Trejo. I'm a first-year PhD at the University of Notre Dame's English department. Today is March 6th, 2025, and we are in the Morris Inn. Our plática today is for Letras Latinas' oral history project, housed at the Institute for Latino Studies and run by Francisco Aragon. This project has been going strong for about 20 years now. And Maria, it is truly an honor to see and hear your voice within this oral history archive several times. Since your 2007 oral history recording, you have grown in so many ways as a human and artist. So I'd like you to reintroduce yourself to us one more time. In addition to stating your name and where you were born, I'd like you to also share what is home for you and how has the idea of home changed or remained the same for you in the last 18 years?
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk, Paulina. And I'm especially thrilled to talk with you today because this is our third major conversation, actually. We had a big event last night where you performed a great interview on stage at the St. Joe Library with the collaboration with Letras Latinas. And that was just a really fun and very touching event to see the response from the audience and the diversity in the audience here in South Bend. That was awesome. And we had a Zoom a couple weeks ago where you shared that you're from El Paso and that really influences your perspective on being here in South Bend. I'm just so happy to talk to you. And when I think about that question about home, I think about kind of some of your remarks too about the difference between what you knew as home in Texas and what your current dwelling here in South Bend. So I do appreciate that question. So I was born in Tucson, Arizona, and I do still have family in Arizona. And my definition of home, I do feel most at home in the US West. We have only lived further east once, my family, and that was in South Carolina. So the western or westernish states that we've lived in are Wyoming and Utah and Colorado and California. And then our Midwestern, but still not that far. Midwestern, we've lived in Indiana and Kansas. We've lived all over. So that how I define home is a little complicated, but I would say US West is sort of the area that I feel the most comfortable. It's the area I've spent the most time. And I define home as having a sense of connectedness, both to people and to communities, but also to the landscape in terms of understanding some landmarks about where I live, that, this river, that mountain, but also understanding some of the ecology in terms of species, being able to recognize trees, being able to understand some of the seasonality of what animals are moving around when, at what time of year. So that's probably my current definition of home.
Yeah, and it rings. There's familiarity in that from when I heard your first recording. So I love hearing that growth, but also how some things are the same and they're
Right.
things we carry just with us forever.
Yeah, that's
And
true.
yeah. There's something from that 2000 recording that you mentioned that I thought was really interesting about how you felt, and it was very vulnerable, it was very honest. You mentioned that the Indiana landscape was shut or not revealing itself to you.
Yeah.
I kind of feel I'm having similar sentiment. That's why I really latched onto that. Unlike, Northern Carolina or California, where you felt connected to the environment, like you were saying, the histories, you knew the names of plants and birds. So without jumping too early into talking about your novel, Not the Killing Kind, I noticed how prominent the mentions of place-specific plants, the redwoods, the buckeyes, the birds, stellar jays and spotted owls, which are very place-specific to the West, appeared in the text. So now that you've lived across high plains and just the US West, as you were saying, and other places globally, from what I've heard, how have you felt connected or not connected to the lands you've inhabited? How does your sense of place inform your writing as you've moved around?
Yeah, I try to feel connected by wherever we've moved, by meeting writers in the area and trying to join writers groups. And I've tried to also, try to understand and connect with Latino issues in whichever area I live. And then my husband is a naturalist. He works in environmental education and in natural resource tourism. He's a big help to me in terms of getting to know the landscape and the plants and all that. In our current location in Wyoming, there are some really strong organizations for advocacy for immigrant justice and inclusion. There's an organization currently called Voices in Jackson, Wyoming. It's a very strong organization for, I would say, for inclusion and equality and equity in terms of a community there that is very currently very stratified economically between basically between brown people and white people, but also between immigrants and non-immigrants. And so I think trying to connect with social issues at the same time, in terms of organizations, and then trying to connect with writers through writers groups and writers organizations are my two goals when I move to a new place. And in Jackson, there's also a very strong writers organization called Jackson Hole Writers, which provides programming all year. And I've just, in Wyoming in particular, I've just had such a great time getting to know the little bookstores around the state. It's very heartening to see. And I think Wyoming is the reddest state. So it's not a given that there will be thriving independent bookstores, but there are in these tiny little towns. So that has been, a really fantastic additional piece of getting to know the area.
Hearing you speak about not just the ecology and the ecosystems of our environment, but the way people inhabit lands you use very similar language that I find really interesting. Like you find, even though you're saying it's a red state, you still find the value and how the people who are doing the work are there and you go find them. You're not just gone. It doesn't exist. Like you're seeking it out. And a lot of the times when we talk about the environment or ecology, we know some things might be, I won't say extinction, but or they're endangered, rather, to not put it so dramatic.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean we shouldn't protect it. So I like the way that at least the way I've been hearing, you combined, the language combines for those naturally.
Oh, that's a great observation. You're making me think of independent bookstores in a new way as a critter on the landscape that could be threatened, but is still there.
There we go.
I love it.
And this brings me to my next question, which we got a chance to hear a little bit about yesterday during the event, but I want to hear you talk through it again. And also, maybe you've thought about something else in the last, I don't know, couple or several of hours.
Yeah.
But to many of us who study literature and identify as writers, these two mediums, poetry and prose, they're sisters. And they each stand on their own, represent their own craft, art, use, and they're deeply interlinked in many ways. The journey between many mediums differs for everyone. It doesn't mean you let go of one the moment you transition to another. Sometimes you carry it with you and it seeps into your other works as well. So I would love to learn about that journey and what that has looked like for you.
Yeah, I love a challenge and I love learning. So I made the leap in part because I felt like I'd kind of hit a wall with poetry, and in part because I was excited to try something new, try something different. So my experience with fiction before starting to write this novel was I had taken maybe just one workshop as an undergrad. And I wrote some short stories in that workshop that I really enjoyed. I actually got a little boost of encouragement and had one of those stories published in a literary magazine that has since closed. It doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, it was very encouraging for me as an undergrad. So I think I filed that away as, a little boost for some possible future fiction exploration. But in grad school, I was very driven to focus on poetry in my own writing, and then in some publishing efforts that I worked on with my mentor, Sandy McPherson, and in collaboration with Francisco's publishing efforts at the start of Mamotombo Press. At the same time, though, I did take one fiction workshop as a grad student with Pam Houston because I loved her writing, and she was and is a full-time faculty member there, and I wanted to take advantage of having Pam Houston in my program. So I took a workshop with her, and the way I think of what I wrote there, I started a novel in her class, or maybe right before I took her class, and it was very dreamy, associative, meditative, moody. In other words, not super big on plot.
Yeah.
And it's in a drawer. Nothing ever came of it, as is right and good. In fact, it was never even finished. I think I had about 130 pages. My takeaways from that workshop, I don't think I took advantage of really learning much craft in that workshop. For whatever reason, my brain wasn't ready to absorb many details of fiction craft in that workshop. I didn't take advantage of it to that extent. But I spent enough time with those 130 pages of the novel in a drawer that I felt like, this is very interesting. It's an interesting experiment to me to try and figure out how this might work. even though I didn't advance too much of my knowledge of how it might work. But anyway, so it's still kind of in the background in the mix. And then, so then it's 2011, 2012. I had these two books out from University of Arizona Press, How Long She'll Last in This World and Flexible Bones. Enjoyed, the experience with University of Arizona, had a good experience with them. But like I said, writing wise, even though it's weird, I was still writing poetry, but I lost the thread of
Yeah.
putting it together and doing like a third book, for example, and had this idea, I want to do something new. So I started working on this novel in late 2011, probably early 2012 is when I got really serious about it. Was 2012. But I want to mention Francisco here. I know that's turning into a long answer.
Please do.
But the part of what's cool, one of the things that's cool about having done this genre pivot is that my longtime friendship with Francisco, who we were graduate school colleagues, we met in 1998, which is, just for the record, that's now 26 years ago, more than a quarter century. Francisco spoke last night about his Momotombo publishing kind of taking place in concert with my mentor, Sandy McPherson's publishing effort with a press that she and I founded together, Swanside Press. That's just like the start of this long intertwining of our careers, because he invited me to dinner with the acquiring editor for University of Arizona. She ended up acquiring my books. So that was, of course, a big influence on my life, additional to just our wonderful friendship. And then he put on a poetry event in Bryant Park. I don't remember what year it was. And that's where I met the editor, Tony Kirkpatrick, Latina editor, who has now been a crime fiction editor for maybe also 20 or 15 years, maybe 15, 20 years. And she acquired this novel. So the transition from poetry to fiction on the material side also involved this network of Latino writers and of support for Latino writers. The acquiring editor at Arizona, she happened to be white, but she ran the series. She's an ally, a Latinx ally, now retired, Patty Hartman. And she ran the next series for Arizona. And then Tony Kirkpatrick, wonderful, strong Chicana editor who is very active. She may, in fact, be the president right now of Latinx in Publishing, an organization that she's a big part of. So that was the other side of my journey from poetry to fiction, was the kind of thread of this community of support for Latinx literature.
Yeah, and I find that really beautiful. It's not, I don't know, sometimes people think that things happen in isolation. I hope we're steering very far away from that. Everything happens in community.
That's
and
a good point.
like the people we know and like the relationships we have with them, and then how those relationships last years, decades.
Yeah.
That's really beautiful. And I think you kind of answered my follow-up question, which was going to be, and that's fine, that it's naturally linked. It was going to be about how not just the artistic transition from seeing your poetry collections to your novel, but also what does it look like on the publishing end and anything like that. So unless you wanted to add any other thoughts on that, we can move on to the next.
Sure. Let's go to the next one.
Yeah. So we're going to try to get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of your work. So I do kind of like questions on all of them, but we are focusing on your novel, since that's where we also celebrated that yesterday, and we've been celebrating it. So in terms of addressing violence, as someone who was born and raised in the El Paso, Juarez borderlands, I've done research, we've talked about this too, on humanizing feminicide data. And I experienced like that rigid dichotomy between how people talk about feminicidal, ecological, immigration, or even just drug cartel violence, as if it were just like a south of the U.S. border kind of issue, rather than acknowledging how violence is deeply systemic and it's a product of U.S. inflicted violence on marginalized people across borders, even within the U.S. So I was really appreciative of how your work has continually addressed and teases out the nuance within these violences. In the poem that I really like from your little green book, the way you call it,
Yes.
How Long She'll Last in This World.
Yeah.
I really like, why can't we all get along? You mentioned Evelyn Hernandez's disappearance, the Daughters of Juarez. In your novel, Boots corrects the detective by insisting they use Armando's name rather than the victim, because they just keep repeating victim, victim. And Boots acknowledges how Haral is potentially trapped. He just got arrested.
Yeah.
Haral hit her son. So she acknowledges that he's potentially trapped in a justice system known to be a hungry machine that could eat up brown boys. So that being said, why was this kind of portrayal of violence important to you, and how do you negotiate writing about these topics across genres?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think when I wrote the poem that you referenced in here, and I just have to say, you're so organized. I love how you already put flags and dog ears and everything. Like, I could find it. You're so organized, Paulina. I think when I wrote this, I was in the midst of a collegiate political awakening, I would say. And not that it was like, it wasn't, I don't mean this because I wrote this when I was in graduate school in Davis, in California, Northern California. And there are these Northern California references that you mentioned, like Evelyn Hernandez. So I don't mean to say, before graduate school, I had no idea that there were race based injustices in the world. But I think I didn't really find a way to start writing about them. I majored in English as an undergrad. And I think, at that time, for whatever reason, I didn't feel like I had a way in to write about political issues. In particular, I wrote about family, I wrote about nature. There were, let's say, like ethnically marked works that I did because I was writing about things like family and the human relation to nature. But it wasn't until grad school that I thought, wait, I have things to say about societal issues. And so the process of including violence that has these layers in it in terms of economic injustice or race-based injustice or gender-based injustice was something that I just felt more free to start addressing. Yeah. Does that answer part of that question for this one?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
it definitely does.
Yeah.
I resonate with that to say,
Ah,
just to keep it short. But
yeah.
I also found that I found more of a voice in my graduate school career, which I guess it brings a little bit of shame. I don't know if that's what you were hinting at, because it's, how dare I, or like barely start acknowledging more. And this is more of me.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting.
But then we realize there's a lot of things in our training that kind of have separated. Again, at least for me, have separated. Like then you're studying poetry, we're a little bit disconnected with the way we can interact with that or touch on it. And grad schools, when I feel like I also had, I have something to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what a great perspective. I'm gonna pick up on what you said about the how dare I. So do you mean that was maybe one barrier to writing about societal issues before you started doing it was a sense of who am I to say something about it?
I think so.
Yeah.
For a long time, I felt like I was just one person. Like my experience couldn't possibly. There's so many experiences,
Yeah.
ways to experience the border.
Yeah.
So I'm like, who am I
Yeah.
to just say this is a border experience or,
Right.
like Latina experience and
Yeah.
Latina experience.
Yeah. That's interesting. That's a great perspective and, painful to have processed. I'm glad you're on the other side of processing it. But I know what you're saying. I'm thinking about that. So in your case, it was like you didn't necessarily want to be standing for every Latina, but you didn't with
Something like that.
Yeah, but yet you had these personal experiences that you later saw value in bringing them into your work. Yeah, that is so interesting. I think part of the issue in my case was that I was raised away from the cultural context of my dad's family. I'm biracial. My mom's white. My dad's was Mexican American. He's passed away since our last interview. And he had some undiagnosed mental health issues that really were a wedge between him and his family. So I was raised away from that context. There weren't cousins, there weren't aunts, there weren't uncles.
Yeah.
They were people who were on the phone. They weren't people who were around me, except we would go visit them from time to time. I think for me, it was like, how could I sort of announce my opinion as coming from a Chicana perspective or a Mexican American perspective when I don't have that context that some people do. So I think that was a hesitancy for me. So yeah, it's interesting to think about what keeps us from getting into it with those issues. And then what is the moment when we do? So I think probably grad school was the moment when I did.
Yeah.
And then including you were saying Boots is like stating, don't call this
Call him by
boy
his
who
name.
was killed, don't call him the victim, call him his name. Yeah, I wanted her as the character to be a little bit, not a little bit, a lot forward about her opinion, very forward about her opinions.
Yeah.
But I also wanted her to kind of like blunder into things here and there too, because she is such a kind of a loudmouth. So I do, I do think that's a moment I wanted her to get it right. I wanted her to say, call him by his name. There are other moments where she just kind of makes a mess of things, but I did want her to get it right. And I wanted to give that one to her. And that was probably in like a midway revision. I just
Mhm.
8 revisions of that novel, and that was probably like midway through it. I was like, okay, let me have her
Yeah.
get in here and try to redirect things in that dialogue.
I think what I'm hearing also, you're bringing up really important points. Something that you mentioned from personal experiences, you felt disconnected from like your, I don't want to speak for you exactly, but Mexicanness or at least like family connection
Yeah.
can potentially bring that.
Yeah.
And then Boots, she's imperfect, but she's human.
Yeah.
She's, being Latina might give us a list or some people a list of what is this character supposed to be like. But I think what you bring to Boots in many ways, in that moment especially too, is her humanness and what does it mean to be Chicana Latina
Yeah.
in the context that she is, which I think really connects to one of my other questions about family, both as you were reflecting about your own personal experience and as we're talking about Boots.
Yeah.
Perfect but human. And that's a really difficult topic to talk about in
Yeah.
Latinx literature. It's very emotionally toiling, I'm assuming,
Yeah.
for the writers.
Right.
But even as the readers, I've found myself very connected to. I know we always think of texts like House on Mango Street. Everyone knows you go home. How the Garcia girls lost their access. There's a list
Yeah.
of books we can talk about with these kinds of family dynamics, especially and not just parental, but multi-generational relationships within a home. And then especially how we consider, and you were touching on that, first, second, and further immigrant generations are socialized in and out of the United States. So it's a very different experience. So you have several poems that talk about motherhood, and you spoke about it in the previous oral history. So I'd like to ask you this time how your novel uniquely explores a mother and adopted son's household. Culture is very complicated, as we were
Yeah.
saying, and it's something that transcends blood. In
Yeah.
many cases, we
Right.
find our culture in maybe not through our family, but in other ways are the communities we meet.
Right.
So could you tell us more about how your work has explored and continues to explore like dynamic family structures in Latinx, Latina, Latino culture?
Right. The sort of simple answer about the family structure in here is that motherhood has been a big part of my adult life. I became a mother at the start of my adult life. And when I was writing the novel, my kids were at home, but I don't think I had teenagers at the time when I started writing it. Maybe I had a young teenager, maybe. But so I put him, it's funny, I put so there's a duo, a mother and a son, a single mother and adopted son. That's a family of 2. And at the time I started, I put Boots as a few years older than me, the mother, and I put Hadal as 18. And I definitely did not have an 18-year-old. And then the 12 years go by that I'm writing the novel and I outgrow Boots and my kids outgrow Hadal. So that may have changed my perspective, but I think fundamentally what I wanted to show with with this mother-child relationship was that complexity that you say. Right around the time I started writing it, I was going through I was in let's see. I was in my late 30s. Yeah, and I was going through a reevaluation of my relationship with my own parents and starting to have some distance from, things that may have been painful in my childhood and starting to acknowledge like the full picture that I have, even if even if whether I have good memories or bad memories, I have gifts that are kind of permanently instilled in me from them, like a love of music and appreciation for reading and for knowledge, among other things. And so I wanted that complexity to be in there. I found once I started sort of processing that about my own family of origin, I found it kind of an interesting topic because like any human relations, the relationship between, teacher and child, or, you're in a social service organization between different committee members or what, like any human relation, there are going to be these troubling parts and these very enriching and life giving parts. So I liked that element of a parent child relationship in a novel. But where you say family is more than blood, I liked how you said that with having the son be adopted. I wasn't necessarily trying to make a point about created family or chosen family, although I have quite a few friends who have adopted children. So I certainly believe, as you say, that family is more than blood. I definitely believe that. I think it was more of a calculated choice to have the son be adopted because I wanted to write something that I had room to imagine. I wanted to write into an area that I didn't know so well. I know so well what it's like to raise biological children.
Yeah.
So I wanted an area that was like unfamiliar, like defamiliarizing the parent child relationship enough that I could like infuse it with some imagination.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight. It's a lot of times I've heard writers say that they stick to the familiar because it's something they feel very passionate, very strong for. But then there's also that needed distance. Like maybe I don't want to write about something so personal because there needs to be some distance there, or just trying something else, something exploring another reality.
Yeah, yeah, that's what I wanted was more the latter, the chance to explore another reality and kind of stretch my imagination without being constrained or limited by my own experiences.
Yeah, yeah. And something else that I was thinking of as you were saying that is in the other Latinx, how I know there's a lot of words that
Yeah,
we're using for
yeah,
Latina literature.
yeah,
Your essay, Curative Poetics,
yeah.
starts off with like an image of your father as well and how it's informed your
Does it?
art. I'm sorry, I mean it just really
Don't bless it. I'm cracking up.
but it's about meditation.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And I found I didn't mean to just bring it up, but I just heard you say like about family and how
Yeah,
we have things that we're trying to make peace with in our past and how that informs us in different points of our life. So
yeah.
I could hear echoes of that and you connect it to being like curative poetics. So to me, your work has a lot of healing components to it as well
Uh,
and embedded into it.
yeah, yeah. Thank you for the chance to refresh myself on all of this starts. That is, yeah, that's an interesting observation. The idea of, I like the idea
Mm.
of language being able to have an impact, to have a spiritual impact, or have a language can have a health impact. I read a study that reading hexameter aloud to a cardiac patient helps stabilize their heart rhythm. Yeah, I do still love that idea. I think of it as more associated with poetry, but I'd like to explore more about the role fiction can have in societal curing of ills. I would like to explore that more.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to say really quickly, this book was edited by Blas Falconer and Lorraine Lopez, and Blas Falconer is also a contributor to this oral history collection. So I'm glad you brought this one up.
Yes, we'll touch upon it a little bit at the end again, but you were saying, I'm like, this is one of the reasons I really liked that essay you wrote.
Oh, I
In
appreciate that.
there. Yeah. So actually, our next question. Yeah, Remedio. So talking about poetic remedies. So in addition to the poem Remedio, which you read for us beautifully last night at the event, you also wrote the Curative Poetics essay, which, as Maria already said, housed in the other Latino, Latinx collection. And you specifically mentioned in the text how it's soul saving
Mm.
poetry specifically. I know we'll branch out into how possibly or what you're thinking fiction
Yeah.
in this context, but it's specifically a cure for quote numbness, despair, disconnection, those words keep ringing in my mind
Uh,
since I've read this. So how does your work play into this today? And how do we write about our communities in a way where we're not just focusing on the violence like we were talking about earlier, but also in seeking remedios, the remedies?
Thank you for pulling out those three words. Yeah, numbness, despair, disconnection. So when I think about the language tools that I have or that I use that I hope work against numbness, despair, and disconnection, the two that I think of are very simply physical details in terms of bringing us back into our animal existence. What is the weather? What color are the leaves on the ground? What is the sky doing? So I do think of that kind of awareness of detail, in particular environmental detail,
Of course.
as being an antidote against a feeling of disconnection, to reconnect with the world through our senses. And then I also think about emotion as a way to hopefully create connection through literature, emotion or empathy, seeing others' emotions or experiencing others' emotions between the reader, the writer, or the characters in fiction or the persona in a poem. So I think about emotions as being the other tool. What I found, I think of poetry as being like a naturally emotional medium, even if it's not explicitly
Mhm.
emotional. And some poets might argue that their poems are not about emotions, they're about other things. They might be right. But I think secretly they can't say, a human cannot say that a piece of expression is devoid of emotion. I don't know. Anyway, arguing with some fictional counterpoint in my head.
Yeah.
But I found it harder in fiction, even though fiction in a novel, readers are counting on being able to understand the character's emotions. But I felt like their emotions were so obvious to me that I didn't put them on the page in my previous drafts. I didn't sort of illuminate their emotions, I think, enough. And so I got some really good feedback, which was, we can't tell how they feel about this. So I said, oh, you can't? So it's obvious to me, but that was because I felt like I was in their heads and they were in my head. So that was harder to do in fiction, but I do hope that, and I do hope that fiction that gives the reader an emotional connection to other characters is one of those things that is an antidote to disconnection. And I think as a reader, I find that's some way that I find some curing from the reading that I do. Yeah.
Yeah. When you said earlier, as a writer, you see it in the poetry. And with fiction, you had to dig in a little
Yeah.
bit more to figure out how you wanted to say the things that you heard up here, but you wanted to put it on the paper as well. And so I was also thinking, I find a lot of healing from both poetry and prose, but I'd have to reflect later on my own, like what exactly from each, how do I find that healing? But it's very powerful. It's very powerful. Branching out into ecology, since we talked about it, we've been talking about it. It's sprinkled into the conversation. And since your previous oral history, you shared about how you started off majoring as a wildlife biologist, which I think is so cool, before switching to English and creative writing. And we can definitely see this in your poetry collections and in Not the Killing Kind. In the first half of the text, I found how Boots associated the North Californian landscape as a haven, and especially as we start kind of unraveling more about her past and the way she had spent time together in the woods or on the beach. But in the second half of the text, we explore landscape kind of becoming nightmarish in a way for Boots, which I think is very unsettling for her since she's thought of it as a haven for so long. And there's a specific part toward that in the second half where she even spots a spotted owl. And I used to know what these birds meant essentially. And now in this, because of the context of that scene, I don't know I can't read the signs around me. And I found that very unsettling, but in a way that I really connected with Boots. So why is it important for you to highlight the natural landscape in this way? Whether it's haven, nightmarish, something in between.
Yeah. I'm glad you picked up on the change in the way that the main character in the novel relates to her landscape. And she does relate to it as a haven in the beginning. And I think I wanted to include that on an appreciation realm. I love sharing an appreciation for nature, and because has been understanding the natural world has been so meaningful to me. So I have a lot of enthusiasm for that. So I wanted to include that in that enthusiast, bent, or just sort of share my enjoyment, especially of the redwoods environment. I find it so marvelous. However, I realized that that's just one way to relate to nature, and there are many different ways to relate to nature. So I did want to bring in this idea that for her, there are limits to how far enjoyment and enthusiasm can go when you're kind of lost in the woods in the dark at night and under threat and hearing predators calling and all this. Yeah, I did want to bring in a kind of the flip side of the coin for her. And in some ways, for me, that's another way of appreciating nature, is sort of appreciating our smallness in the face of the power of nature, which isn't always apparent in suburban living, for example. That's where I grew up. And that's Boots's initial setting. It's not apparent necessarily the force of nature. So, I'm glad you brought up that contrast. Did I answer that question?
Yeah, yes, you did. It's great. Yeah. And I think that ties in with the way that sometimes we feel in control in nature. And that's, probably why people feel comfortable in nature, but it's also not how should I say this? We're not in control of nature. So it's interesting that a lot of people feel like they are in control of something, whether it's like they get to be alone and just be like on their own, not focusing on other people or suburban life, whatever it is. So it's interesting. So I thought that move wasn't meant to be like nature's bad or anything like that. It's like actually nature is its own living, breathing thing. And we're just it depends how we're entering it under
That's
which
right.
circumstances.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah. And connecting that to an earlier question I was going to ask, and I think it's good to tie it in here, is about the ice raids
Mm.
in Not the Killing Kind. And you also have a poem about it in Inflexible Bones
Mm.
called El Villain. Yes, El Villain.
Yeah.
El Villan is always how I want to.
That's right. That's how it looks.
That's that looks up. And one of the things you said in your previous oral history, quoting you, you felt the obligation as a writer to respond to those raids, which I found was very powerful. And clearly we've seen you've been documenting these histories from when you were at that time writing from a place in Utah in Logan, and now writing about that kind of environment and how it happens seemingly like under cover of a lot of our daily activities. A lot of us live among ICE detention centers and people don't know. So it's interesting how it's not somewhere isolated.
Yeah.
It's in the heart of cities oftentimes. Why is it important to you to keep talking about immigration raids, ICE? Because you name ICE specifically in a lot of your work. How do you approach writing about that specific topic?
I I grew up with this idea of having a sense of kinship or maybe like social responsibility for the welfare of immigrants as a vulnerable population. I think it was because of my dad's example. He is not an immigrant. He was born in the US. He was born in the border in Douglas, Arizona, and his parents were immigrants. But his impulse was he had an impulse of concern toward immigrants who were in vulnerable positions. For example, he had two young boys that he kind of mentored and would take them on family outings with us. They were from a recent immigrant family. He would hire immigrants who came through to do jobs at the house. And it was clear he was doing that because he wanted to support them, not because we necessarily had jobs that needed doing. So I guess I think it comes from him, this idea of we have to look out for people who are newer to the country or who may need some help. And so I think that was part of the idea that I needed to respond to this is in Utah, the poem that you mentioned in here takes place in Utah, and there were these nationwide, covered in the news, nationwide Day of Our Lady of Guadalupe raids around the country at workplaces. And so I think I like that it touched on that sense of needing to at least have spoken out against it in some way. I feel very inadequate in terms of how I am or am not able to respond, but I did want to sort of go on the record as being outraged. And I mentioned it in particular. I mean, the unfortunate thing about the way we talk about these rates is that they become this focal point without this awareness that there are other issues that we could talk about too, in terms of housing justice, kind of daily life issues, housing justice, access to the economic system, et cetera. But these roundups, these raids are such like headline makers. So, because of that, because it was a big headline, it was a big news item in our town, is why I wanted to jump in on that in 2000. So maybe around 2010 is when it happened. But unfortunately, it's an ongoing issue. So that brings us up to the current writing. Yeah, that just came out last year.
Yeah, even things that have happened in the last month.
Yes. Yeah. I was just talking about our little stack here. But yeah, in terms of our headlines. Oh, unfortunately. Yeah. In terms of our headlines, there's part of the ongoing injustice.
I found that as I was reading your poems these last months, I'm like, I feel like she's writing today. Just wrote this. So it's both. It's terrifying, but also very artistic at the same time. And how your writing, like I was saying yesterday, transcends time, because it was very much, maybe it's because I happened to be reading them in the moment, but yeah, it's definitely been something very needed to talk about. And I think you said something in your comment there about how you felt like you need to say something, and that connects well with kind of how we started the oral history with who are we to say something, but it's if you don't say something, then who? So I commend you for doing that work for years, and I'm sure you'll continue to do it as well in your writing.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So our last question is about your name. We noticed I noticed you introduced yourself differently in the first oral history. So I wanted to give you space to address that in however you would like.
Sure. Yeah. These two books are Maria Melendez books. I noticed that I think it was a 2007 one that I used my married last name too, introducing myself, which for a while I mean, I'm still married to the same person, but for a while I legally had it at the end of my name, which was Gallagher. I think at some point I decided that was too much of a mouthful. I kept my first, middle, and last and added Gallagher. So that was Maria Teresa Melendez Gallagher. Maria Teresa Melendez is my birth name. So I think I just decided that was too much of a mouthful.
Yeah.
Published as Maria Melendez. Interesting sidebar is that Francisco said, "Why don't you have accents in your name?" So I put accents in my name for my first book, and then I took them out for my second book because I was raised speaking English only by the decision of my father. And so I speak English, I write in English. So I said, okay, I say my name in an anglicized way. So I'm going to take the accents out in the second book. But then we get to the third book, and all of a sudden it's Kelson on the cover. I'm going to answer your question. I'm just getting through
No, I
what
love this.
actually exists, and then we'll get to the whys. Kelson on the cover, but on the copyright page, I'm smuggling in my birth name, so it's Maria Melendez Kelson. On the copyright, that's my middle name now. It's Melendez. So I lost Teresa or Teresa. So now my name is Maria Melendez Kelson. That's my legal name. All right. Why? In this time when I was reevaluating my relationship to my family, when I was in my late 30s, I wanted to choose a new name that wasn't my father's and wasn't my husband. So a kind of a feminist, kind of a first wave feminist gesture. So that was one impulse. I liked the word Kelson. I wanted some word that had some kind of literary meaning and emotional meaning. And there's a line in Walt Whitman, Song of Myself. I think it's section 5, where he writes, "A Kelson of the creation is love. And the Kelson holds the ship together, ties the keels together on a ship." And I thought, oh, I really like that ideal of life and existence kind of being held together by love. So I said, okay, that's the word. I like that. But I was nervous about ditching Melendez because being Mexican American is a big part of my identity. It's part of my writing. It's a part of how I relate to the world. So I was nervous about that. So I workshopped the name change with some other Chicana writers, Shana Carraza and Barbara Carrillo, who she's actually from the Redwood country in Northern California. So the two of them, we got together in the AWP. I invited them to my room and had, drinks and snacks for them. And I was like, I have a really important question. What do you think of this? I'd be betrayed. Will I be betraying my race? I was very angsty about it. And they were like, whatever, it's your name. Do what you want with it. So they kind of helped me sort of get over that and realize that I'll still be who I am. I'll still be the writer I am with this new name. And I'm biracial. I'm half white. So I felt like this sort of represents who I am. Now, the other factor that I thought moving from Melendez to Kelson, after the variety of reception that I had gotten from these books, I thought there are some in the mystery world, there are some readers who will pick up a book with this last name on it, Kelson, who might not pick up a book with the last name Melendez on it.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I had the impression that some readers some non-Hispanic readers who might have had an interest in some of my issues, like environmentalism or something, might have looked at that and said, oh, that's a book for Latino people or for Latinx people. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong about that. I'm not sure. And now, so now I have the other issue is now I'm like I want people to know who might be interested in what we could consider Latinx issues like family and immigration, education, justice, criminal justice. I want them to know this is a Latina book. So now I have to pipe up about that because I don't have the Melendez. So now I'm on the other side of trying to clarify where I stand and who the book is for.
No, that's a really interesting journey. I liked hearing you walk us through it as well. I was always raised with I was raised with a Catholic background, so part of the lessons were the moment someone changes their name, it's the start of a new relationship with themselves or with some other being of some sort. So whenever I see name changes, I'm like, there's a story there. And I liked it when possible. We ask about it. Sometimes it's, not proper to ask about it, but I thought it was very artistic of you to choose this name. And this is how you will be known in your novel. Everything you've been saying, though, the questions you've been having are all, I think, really important for you to consider, but also people in general, other writers who consider how their name appears on a book and how that impacts how people pick it up. That's something we've been talking about for centuries. It's not
Right.
and yeah, we didn't just make it up. It's something very real and unfortunate that some people could potentially have some bias with how they pick up books like that. So I really appreciate you walking us through that thought process.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love how you brought up the Catholic sense of import around naming and renaming. I was raised Catholic as well.
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say that it sort of rang in my head that like a confirmation name is an example of what you're
Yeah.
saying. Like a confirmation name that represents a new aspect of your spiritual journey. So yeah, I hadn't thought of name changes that way. And that's it gives a fun shading to writers who use multiple pen names too. Some
Yes.
writers, does each of them have a little soul? Does each of their pen names have a little soul or a little spiritual existence? So thank you for that little thought experiment. I'll be chewing on that.
Oh, yeah. I was thinking also about the way we like prophets. Like the moment you
Mhm.
become a prophet, your name changes. And
Ah,
but also, yeah, confirmation names. I have like
yeah,
confirmation names
that's
and everything.
right.
So it's very interesting to think.
Yeah.
We'll be thinking about this, I'm sure, outside of
Think about it.
this
That's
space.
right. Yeah.
But yeah, so to end, I wanted to end with a couple of readings from you. Since you were celebrating the Not the Killing Kind, I, of course, want you to read from Not the Killing Kind
Oh,
if
sure.
possible.
Sure.
And then also more of a selfish ask, but if you could read Why Can't We All Just Get Along from your little green book.
Perfect.
And it could be in whichever order speaks to you.
Okay.
From Not the Killing Kind, I think that scene that we spoke about, Haral and Boots at the Koya Park, and there's a
Oh,
lot going on. You can
perfect.
read as much or as little of those as you want.
Okay.
But yeah, whichever ones you want to start with.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you. I'll start with the section from the novel. And as you mentioned, this is all the son. He's 18 years old, and his mother, Boots, and she has decided to bring him to a local park. This is when she's in her nature as refuge phase, not her
Oh,
nature
yes.
as threat phase. So she wants to bring him to a park to see if they can come to some accord. He's cut school. She doesn't know why. She's very pissed off at him.
Yep.
And so let's see how they do. This is a mother and her teenage son, her 18-year-old. He has said they're walking along, and he has said to her, "Look, you can't ground me. You can't take my car. I'm helping a friend of mine." But he won't say anything more. The other little piece of backstory is that not only has he cut school, but he has been caught shoplifting. And it wasn't shoplifting something you might think of as gender typical, like some beef jerky or some cigarettes or something like that. No, he was shoplifting prenatal vitamins. Yes. So she's very concerned what the heck is going on here. And he won't, of course, won't tell her why. All right. He says, "You can't ground me. You can't take my keys. I need to go out tonight. You have to trust me." So Boots says, "Okay, here's the deal. I'm trying to trust you. That's good. That's real good. God, I don't know if I'm stupid or what, but you say you're handling something? Fine. Have your car tonight, but you will be back by 8 p.m. I'm sure you have homework or you can study for finals. 8 p.m. and then hit the books. Got it?" "Sir, yes, sir." I smiled. I couldn't help it. He was being goofy, and I was relieved I didn't want to kill him anymore. He turned to head back up the trail. "No, wait. I want you to turn around and hear the rest of this." He spun back around on one foot and flashed jazz hands. "I'm serious," I said, laughing. He dropped his arms and said, "Yeah, you are," pleased with himself. "Starting tomorrow, the only thing you use your car for is to get to and from school." I forced my face back into an expression of earnest agitation, which brought back up how I really was agitated. "I'm going to follow you. I'm going to watch you walk inside that building. I have a parent meeting at daybreak tomorrow afternoon, but when I get home, I better see you there. Deal? 8 p.m. tonight, nothing but school and home tomorrow. You got it, boss." We turned to where the forest opened onto a playground, now empty. Shadows crept out from the bushy salal where they'd hidden all day. "Maybe 9 tops," Hadal said. "I won't be any later than 9, promise." He pulled on each of his fingers one at a time. The tiny cracks of each joint spoke the worries he tried to hide. When Hadal wasn't home at 9, I was annoyed. By 10, I was frantic. I knew people could disappear. I'd had it happen before.
Thank you.
Thank you for the chance to read that, share that little excerpt.
And then, oh yeah, you already know I tabbed it.
Oh, yeah, Evelyn. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay. The why can't we all just get along? Why can't we all just get along? Getting political. Getting political in 2006. Why can't we all get along? This is from How Long She'll Last in This World. Think of pink pickup trucks and picture dead Americans doing their Vietnam era combat dying in neat ethnic proportion. All hail the proportional dead. Visualize non-perishable respect handed out in paper bags to neighbors. A dignity pantry open 24 hours. Then, I suppose, we could each have a friendly lick off the other's cone. But this is your real mother on public assistance talking. Is the salt in all these crackers and canned goods not supposed to kill me? Why can't I use these vouchers for organic cheese and milk? Why are the wealthy allowed to be healthier than me? Deep, cleansing breath, everyone. Oppression isn't rocket science. It's easy enough to ignore the torso of Evelyn Hernandez, afloat on the shore of the bay a year before Lacey, her maternity shirt a billowing jellyfish crown animated by waves, her case rejected from the rolls of America's Most Wanted. SF Homicide tried spreading the word. I'm sorry to say, Evie, that without any lacy white wedding photos to show, newsmakers thought no one would care much. You are only 24, and being Salvadoran, maybe no one had shown you yet how the gods of public opinion get fed around here. The days of good news are behind us. Now a group of elites claiming expertise on the whole Christ thing assures us he was way more uptight about two men trying for wedded bliss than the brutal dismemberment of women with names like Hernandez. Sorry, senorita, the Bible's pretty clear on this one. You don't need a PhD to see this as a slap in the dead face of an entire chain of mothers knotted and tangled together, circling down through history and coming to rest on the knife point of the present as rosary beads circle down to Christ's nailed feet. While we're on the subject of murdered muchachas, could someone please ask the slaughtered daughters of Juarez not to shriek so loudly at night? They're bothering some nice people in Texas. Would they mind not being so political all the time? Say the P word as though invoking the name of a hated vegetable. For example, could you not be so lima bean all the time? Everyone knows that only a few Texans, only a few Americans get to be political, and then only on TV. I'm not an angry person, really. I've never yelled at the snow for melting or cursed a grasshopper for disappearing into the weeds when I wanted to catch it. A river killed a man I loved, and I love that river still. Rough treatment from the great beyond, I've come to expect it. But someone who, the Son of Man, told me I could expect better from the hands of humans. In all fondness for the grasshoppers, I say, my neighbors and I are no better than insects. May the peace of legally recognized newlyweds be with us all, and may Evelyn's broken breath, as recorded in the bay waves, fill our ears until we're deaf to the call for complacency.
Thank you.
Thank you for the chance to share it.
And this conducts our oral history. Thank you so much, Maria, for sharing your journey, your growth, everything with us in this recording, the previous recording. It's really special to get to hear from you like this.
Thank you for the chance to converse, Paulina. I look forward to hearing more about your career as a scholar and as a creative and active and vibrant participant in Latinx literature, letters, and life. And thank you, Letras Latinas. You're with us in the background. Thank you, University of Notre Dame.
Thank you.